Hey, welcome to the Social Thread podcast. Social Thread is a nonprofit where you can explore your faith on your own terms. You can belong, you can thrive, and you can do that in community. And I am Robert Payne, and I am the Community Development Director here at Social Thread. And as always, I am joined by
Rob Reinders. Getting more confident in saying that each episode.
yes,
I can say my
yes,
name.
yep, awesome. And we have a fantastic guest with us today, Joe Webb.
Yeah. So this one's a little different, and Joe, we're really excited to have you here. So you're on our podcast, but we're also going to be on your podcast.
Right. Yeah.
It'd be
Yeah.
great. We're
So,
killing two birds with one stone.
oh yeah, the layers of redundancy are just glorious here. I love
That is the theme today. We're redundant, or we're just dunces. I don't know how what those have to do with each other. Anyway, Joe, you and I met through a mutual friend like weeks ago.
Yeah.
But I feel like we've known each other forever. But I know you. I feel like I know you. You've come to one of our meetups, so Robert knows you a little. But we'll give you a chance to introduce yourself to our folks, and then maybe we can introduce ourselves to your folks.
That'd be great. That'd be great. Yeah. So my name's Joe Webb. Like Rob, I am an ordained United Methodist deacon, which is the most confusing clergy classification, I think, in the world, because what we United Methodists call deacons is completely different than what people in any other denomination call. We're actually closer to what like the Catholic structure is to most other Protestant denominations, I think. But yeah, so I lead an online community, much like y'all do with Social Thread. Largely, not by purpose did we become an online community, but because of COVID we did, and found out that it worked really well. But it's kind of I call it a non-traditional faith community, because we're sort of built on these principles that that conversation is really at the heart of who we are as a faith community. That a lot of us are folks who have some serious frustrations with the institutional church, even though we may still be pretty firmly embedded there, and we're just trying to seek to better understand our place in the world, right? So that's a big chunk of what I do, is to lead that community. It's called New Wineskins. And then I also host, as you said, a podcast called Accidental Tomatoes, which everybody laughs whenever I say it. There's a whole story. I'll plug my website later, and you can go read the Accidental Tomato story. And then I do a blog. I've been blogging for a long time, much longer than I've been podcasting, because I've always been kind of a writer at heart. And I'm just letting go of the blog like very reluctantly, as I realize that nobody's reading blogs anymore. But there's still a few out there. So.
We're just reading tweets.
Yeah.
Reading all the tweets.
Right.
Blogs are too long.
Yeah, and unless you're writing a blog on how to make an eight-year-old's skeleton costume, then that's high traffic content right there.
Yeah,
nice.
You gotta have a natural kind of Pinterest connection to get traffic.
Yeah.
Yeah. I still have it. I did a Pinterest board once, and it like freaked everybody out, because they're like, "Why are you doing Pinterest?" And I'm like, "I don't know. It seemed like fun." And like, you're not into that. I'm like, "You're right. I'm not into that." So it's sort of like how I feel about TikTok right now.
Yeah.
Trying to get into that, and I don't get it, but I'm old. So anyway, we digress. So
Welcome
Joe,
to my world, man.
Yeah. So you mentioned your community is a lot similar to our community, and Social Thread is, as Robert said at the beginning of our sort of intro, which your folks won't hear, or I guess they will if they listen to our podcast. Our listeners are your listeners.
It's all about cross-pollination.
It is all cross-pollination. But we're a community where we're trying to help people scratch that, I guess, faith and spirituality itch, but do it on their own terms. And I know you want to talk about some of the research and some projects that I worked on that led to this community. Right. But we found too that we were pushed into an online world, but we're trying to figure out, I think, how to be back in person eventually. But and we can talk about how that's opened us up to community across the country, much like your community has.
Right.
But yeah, we do these weekly meetups where I think somebody described it the other day. Robert, you correct me. It's like a friendly conversation about topics on faith and life. And yeah, so I think that's what we've been trying to do, and be a place for spiritual refugees, but also people who maybe have never been involved or never been part of a community where you're exploring a spiritual or faith-based path.
Yeah, we kind of refer to ourselves at New Wineskins as conversation and community for spiritual exiles. And I think, okay. I like that, spiritual refugees, spiritual exiles. I think there's a lot of us out there. And I, like I said a second ago, I think a lot of folks who kind of feel that way are still pretty firmly connected with their own, like their local church, faith community, whatever, but are just feeling this sense of, I don't know, frustration, incompleteness. Like what we've witnessed in our community is, from the folks who are still kind of connected to churches, is like they love their church, they love that community, but they're really like aggravated by the lack of ability to have really hard conversations about some of the like taboo topics, like human sexuality and race and things like that we polite church folks just don't want to talk about. So so we just kind of felt like if we can create a space for that, like that'll lead to some kind of a community, right? So we started ours just to kind of give you a little bit of background. I started this thing out very informally before I was an ordained clergy person, just gathering some friends in like the private events room of this little local brew pub close to where I live, and just kind of build it as a place where we could come and talk about Jesus and drink beer at the same time, which.
Sign me up, I'm in.
Yeah, not surprisingly, a lot of people were very interested in that, right? And I knew, like, this was in 2014, and I knew from the very first time, like, these people came. I probably 20 some people showed up the first time, and all I had done was like emailed some people, and maybe Facebook messaged some people that I thought might be interested, but I didn't do any like public posts, no marketing, anything like that. And like these people showed up and they all had some connection with me or came with somebody who knew me, but they didn't know each other very well. Like a lot of the folks didn't know each other, but the level of like authentic vulnerability that people showed from the very beginnings of the conversation really told me that we were onto something, that we were scratching an itch that people were really looking for. Right. So, and I think when we get, in a little bit, when we talk about some of your research, I think, some of the work you did kind of bears that out. Like we came upon it kind of accidentally and organically. Yeah. But I think there's a reason for that, right?
Yeah. And I think you put words to maybe what folks who are still in church, but also doing New Wineskins. And by the way, I mean, there's so many parallels to what you're doing and what we're doing, because a lot of our participants are church folks too, but feel like, and I don't even know if it's a supplement as much as an addition to their church experience. They're rounding something out. Like there was this missing piece. And the vulnerability and authenticity piece is so huge. And I think churches, for all the good that churches do, there's horrifying things that churches do, but that vulnerability and authenticity piece, I hear that over and over again. Like, why is that not happening at church, but folks are craving that so much?
Yeah.
Well, I think one of the most powerful things about what we're doing at Social Thread, and maybe you are finding this too, Joe, is that we say right at the outset that there isn't a doctrinal statement that people have to abide by for
Yeah.
social thread. And so I think that there is a mental trigger that once they're in an environment where they're not subject to dogma, to judgment,
Yeah.
or having to have an answer that's in a specific mind frame, then suddenly they're able to be vulnerable. They're able to answer and ask questions that are really hard. Maybe there's just some kind of block at a church where they can't ask that question, because they know if they ask that question or give that answer, or say, hey, I feel this way, that immediately they're going to feel judgment and feel shame. And so I think providing that is and I think that there's also a fear too in a lot of church leaders that, oh, well, we can't go that way. That's going to create a lot of dangerous, it's going to create a lot of like unorthodox doctrine or practices. But I think what we have found, though, is that by able to answer those questions in a safe place, people are able to deepen their spiritual walk, whatever their faith path or wisdom tradition might be.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think for a lot of leaders, I think there's a fear that if I don't have the answers, there's a fear of loss of credibility or authority or whatever goes along with that. One of the things, I guess if we had a doctrinal statement at New Wineskins, it would be, answers are boring. I'm more interested in the questions. Right? And it's like an unofficial mantra, but I repeat it over and over and over again, especially when folks show up. And we still, like, even after 6.5 years, I'm still seeing new people show up, in our Zoom calls now, but used to be, in our in-person meetings, like pretty regularly, not every single week, but, every month or so, somebody will pop in either by invitation from another person, or just happen to see us, online somewhere and wanted to check it out. And so, whenever there's somebody that hasn't heard me say that before, I say it again, because I think it's just foundational to just for us specifically as a community. Like, I don't really care about giving you answers, but I really want to give you the space to ask the questions that you need to ask. Now I might give you my opinions about those things, and I'll try to be really careful to say, this is just my opinion. And it might be based on a theological education and all of that, but still, like, at some point, leaders have to be humble enough to say, I might be wrong about this, and that's okay.
Yeah, and I think that's really powerful, because I think people really want to be able to explore the questions. And I think when you get to a point where you're realizing, hey, the question is probably the most important thing than just to find the answer. I really like how you are giving, because even though that might not seem traditional, but that's still, you're giving structure in which people can explore their faith, and I really like that.
Yeah.
I was interviewing a local rabbi yesterday for my Accidental Tomatoes podcast, and we got to talking about the Talmudic tradition and the Midrash tradition of storytelling in Judaism. And one of the things that really resonated with me that he said, and I need to kind of spend some time thinking about this, was this very Jewish idea that the point of reading the scriptures is not to give us answers per se, that the point is the engagement, right? And especially when we're engaging with those sacred writings in community, that is far more important and more like influential and more transformative than just simply opening up this book to try to get answers to life,
Yeah. And two, I think one of the breakthroughs I've had psychologically or intellectually or whatever is there's this layer of what can and what can't we talk about, right answers, wrong answers, around doctrine, theology, and politics. And that's like sort of one level. And I think for people who are interested in those conversations, that provides a certain type of stimulation. But what I found is there's this even deeper base level of just like, how do I how do I survive today?
Yeah.
How do I get through this thing I'm going through with my family, with my kids, and whatever. And I think in more progressive, like social justice oriented, traditional in that sense, churches, those things are seen as like, oh, well, that's, whether we intend to do that or not, there's a shame in, well, that's being selfish. That's not thinking about the bigger picture, or whatever. So we need to find the right answers on these topics, and sort of your own base level needs come second. But what I think we found is like, man, if you're miserable, if you are not the person you're trying to be or called to be, like, you can't help other people if you can't help yourself.
Yeah.
And the vulnerability piece is huge in that, because we all just judge the hell out of each other. And it's like, man, if I say I'm afraid, or I'm struggling, I don't know how to be a good parent or a good spouse, or I hate my effing job.
Yeah.
But people are going to look down on me for that, and I'm afraid to say that. Like, I'll never deal with that, and that's just going to get build up. And that's a huge part of our faith, is like, you know, who we are and who we're created to be, and how we deal with the struggles of life and the anxieties and all of those things. So I think that's what's been really powerful for me through this journey, is like, oh my God, everyone's scared to freaking death. And we don't know how to do this adulting thing. And there's aren't spaces to talk about this where we're not constantly comparing each other to one another.
Yeah. How much of that do you think might also be like not just the fear of judgment from others, but also the fear of our own judgment of ourselves? Like, if that idea gets out of my mouth into the world, then I have to own that, right?
I got to deal with it.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think you're spot on. You're totally spot on. So talk about, you've mentioned accidental tomatoes a couple times now. What's
See how subtle I am when I plug?
Yeah. What's the story behind the name?
Yeah, so I'll try to give you the shortest version that I can.
Sure.
So I went to this thing called Wild Goose Festival last year. I don't know if you're aware of that, but it kind of has grown out of the progressive tradition. Brian McLaren and a bunch of those kind of more progressive theologians brought the idea back from a festival called, I think it was called Greenbelt or something like that in England.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. And so it's been one of those things that I've been wanting to do for a long time. Like, it's just this hippie Christian festival thing, with music and like all of the people whose books I read and podcasts I listen to and all of that. And so I finally got a chance to go last year after trying for several years. And I came back from that just like with this, it was like there was something that flipped in my brain that said, all of these things that you always said, I wish I could, I have now witnessed that there are other people that are doing that and that it's possible. And you can, and so I came home and I was thinking about like, okay, I'm going to start a podcast. I'm going to relaunch this blog. I'm going to quit my job with the corporate church, and which I was on our conference staff for a couple of years in the communications office, which it was a great job. I loved it. But like I needed to do something new and different. Like that's when I go back and tell people like my call story, right? That's always been at the heart of it. Like that there's got to be something new and different, a new paradigm. So all of this is kind of stewing in my brain, and I'm thinking about, okay, I'm going to start this podcast. I'm kind of thinking about what the format's going to look like. And I'm an old marketing guy, so like I need a brand, right? I need a name. And so I've got this outside my kitchen window. There's a little herb garden in our front landscaping. And several years ago, I had planted, just the standard like basil and thyme and oregano and stuff. And then I threw in like some hot pepper plants and some cherry tomatoes because I wanted to make fresh homemade salsa. And I planted cherry tomatoes because I didn't want to deal with full-size tomatoes. I just wanted little things. So, the garden did really well that year, and then at the end of the season, I cleaned it out. And I've got a black thumb. I can't grow things to save my life, but I just got lucky. The weather was right. Things grew really well. And then that fall, I like dug up everything because I was going to start over again the next year. It was kind of getting out of control. And I just never got around to like replanting anything or putting any new dirt in the thing. And shortly after I got back from Wild Goose last year, I'm looking out in that little patch of dirt that like weeds are growing up in it, and I've been spraying Roundup trying to kill the weeds, and like I feel like a complete environmental traitor every time I do that, but it's the only way I know how to do it. And so I cleaned all the weeds out of it and stuff, and I look out the window and there's this plant poking up. I'm like, man, I got to go out there and pick weeds again. I go out and look at it, and it's a tomato plant. Like, and this metaphor hit me, right? That here's this plant that in soil that's been totally untended for 2 years. In fact, that I actively tried to destroy, but this thing is persisting on growing. And I just saw this association between that stupid little tomato plant and the people who have been disenfranchised from the institutional church, right? That we actively neglect them. We sometimes even actively damage them. We create toxic environments. And then we wonder why they won't come to our churches. And yet, despite all of the things that we do wrong, people still persist, right? They still persist in pursuing Jesus, like outside of the church. And I'd had enough conversations with folks to know, and just, because we'd been doing New Wineskins for a while at that point, like I knew that was a lot of people's story. And that they were hungry for that kind of community. And so that's sort of the short version of how that name came about. But it's just, a metaphor created a brand, and it went from there.
Nice.
That was a great story.
Yeah. I hear that. That's come up with a name that gets people. I mean, it has a story behind it anyway, but it's also one that says, "Ooh, tell me more about that."
Yeah.
Right. Where'd that come from? That's automatic talking point. About something you're passionate about.
What I found interesting, when you and I first started talking, Rob, when our friend Neil kind of introduced us, and like I think you said at the outset that you kind of like we felt like we've known each other forever, even though it's only been a few weeks.
Yeah.
And I think our friend Neil saw something in us both that said
he's good at that.
There's this kindred spirit kind of thing. Maybe it's a quantum entanglement thing. That's kind of my new that's my new obsession. I hear Richard Rohr talking about quantum entanglement. I'm like, oh, that's good stuff, man. I got to do. But
I think we have a topic for a meetup.
But as we got to talking, and I attended a social thread meetup, and you attended a New Wineskins gathering. I started to see this. What really interested me was, you had done a bunch of research that kind of led to where you were with starting social thread. I started New Wineskins kind of seat of my pants and very organically, but I saw this kind of confluence of purpose in those things. And I said to somebody, it might've been Neil, I don't remember. I said to somebody, like, you were like 3 years ahead of me on the research and the planning, and we were like a couple of years ahead of you all on like the actual execution part of it. And since I had that idea, I've kind of been imagining, a conversation about that, like about how these two worlds kind of have converged and may continue to like converge in the future. I don't know where that might go, but I just think there's some interesting possibilities there.
Yeah. And to give people more context, we back up to, I was a United Methodist campus minister at Arizona State for 5 years. And, you're working with young adults in one of the most formative, if not the most formative time of their life, but also their most exploratory time of life. And then from that, I started a church for basically those adults who were graduating from college, and they were coming to, in the United Methodist Church. If you're listening and you're not a United Methodist, we call our college ministries Wesley Foundations, and had students coming back on break and stuff who graduated and be like, I can't find anything that's like Wesley Foundation out in the world. And so I'm just not going to church. I'm not continuing on that faith journey. And I look back on it at the time, now having done some professional research around this, being like, oh my God, I totally know what was happening now. And we'll come back to that in a second. So I started this church for like, okay, I got to find this place for these young adults. And even though they were moving across the country, I'm like, there's got to be more in Phoenix who are like this and are looking for community. So I did that, got totally burned out in my third year of doing that, totally wrecked, and totally my own fault. Just had no idea what my mind and body and soul were going through, and just kept trying to push it and push it and push it. And, you know, you can only do that to yourself for so long. Took a break, built some healthy habits, and then came back and was like, man, there's a healthier Rob. There's got to be a healthier way to do church. Yeah. There's got to be a healthier way to do religion and spirituality, because there's so many people out there screaming and saying, I'm not becoming a better person. In fact, I'm deeply wounded. I'm deeply hurt. And even if I didn't have that bad experience, I'm hearing about that bad experience and saying, man, I got all these problems in life, and I should be able to go to the church, but all I'm hearing is horror stories about people getting chewed up and spit out for all kinds of various reasons. And I said, you know what? Got to do that. We can do this differently. And I walked right into project managing a research project of, well, why are people leaving religion? Why are people fed up with religion? And is there anything we can do about it? And just to save all of us time, it came down to this base key learning of our brains are wired differently in the world. And there's a spectrum, and on one end of the spectrum is what we call traditionalists, people who value tradition and authority and a particular way of doing things, and who need that. Like, that's just how their brains are wired. And on the other side, people who want to figure it all out on their own and want to do it on their own terms. And for the longest time, the world was mostly traditionalists. And again, we fall along a spectrum. There's no there's no pure hardcore traditionalists. There's no pure explorer. You know, everyone kind of bunches around the middle. But for the longest time, it leaned towards that traditionalist side. And now, as we know from just, you know, common sense, but also looking at all the Pew studies and stuff that have been done around people leaving church and spiritual but not religious and stuff like that, now that big group of people is tipping more on the explorer side. So more and more people rejecting the tradition, and people saying it's the YouTube generation. My kids don't ask me how to do something. They're like, hey, they go on YouTube. So I'll figure this out all by myself. I don't need your help. Like, and so I need to start making YouTube videos of myself teaching them how to be adults. But anyway, but I think that explains a lot of what's going on. And I don't want to let churches and religious organizations who have done real harm to people, because, you know, there is no excuse for a lot of things that have been done. But I think a lot of the general, like, what's happening is you have a lot of explorers who are in traditionalist situations, and, you know, you put those two forces together without knowing what's happening, and people are going to go nuts. They're going to be like, they're starting to say, I don't fit here. It just doesn't feel right. I have questions and I want to ask questions and I can't. And the traditionalists are just saying, like, why would you ever ask questions? That's dumb. Like, that's crazy. Why would you ask
evil.
questions? Right. Evil. Yeah. And so my aha moment was sort of we do need to figure out a way to all kind of live together and be in healthy community together. But at the same time, like, let's stop trying to force traditionalists to be explorers and explorers to be traditionalists. Like, our institutions and how we do these things don't have to be static. We don't take we don't get a ride to the airport like we used to, in a taxi cab. We're not going to be all driving gasoline based cars for much longer. There's just a million different ways we do things and we explore things. And religion, I think, has to adapt to that as well, while still saying, like, you want to drive a gas guzzling SUV long term, that's not practical, but that's who you are and that's your thing, and other people do it differently. So let's stop trying to force each other in one box. And let's provide some more boxes.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's really important, because I think a lot of times, and you kind of alluded to this a little earlier, like a lot of times the progressive notion is it's almost its own kind of fundamentalism, right?
Mm-hmm.
Agree with me or else, in the same way that progressives are rejecting, a more conservative approach that seems to say agree with me or else. Yeah. And I think that recognition, I love the imagery of a spectrum, right? That we're all in sort of these different places, and an institution like the church needs to be really intentional about making space for all of those folks wherever they are on that spectrum. And I think the one thing, and I think it's starting to happen, and I think maybe folks like us are kind of, and this is not to like blow our horns or anything, although maybe they deserve to be blown. But like, I think there's some of us that are kind of out on the
PG-13 podcast now,
out on the leading edge of, what does it look like to have the right leaders in the right places for those kinds of things? We've always, especially in the United Methodist Church, we've always kind of had this kind of a cookie cutter approach. I mean, we somewhat attempt to place pastors with congregations where there's a little bit of a match, a convergence but we can't thoroughly do that. Yeah. And so you end up with, pastors that hate their congregation or congregations that hate their pastor. And it's not because either of them are bad. It's just that it's not a good match. And
they're wired differently.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think what your research has shown and what you were just talking about is to say, all right, here's these people fall along these spectrums. Now, how can we put the right leaders in the right places for those folks wherever they are, right?
Or even just having that awareness, like, a lot of stuff you learn in therapy is just like, when you know what's happening to you, that in itself is so powerful.
Oh, and,
I can't get out of this situation, or I can't fix, my level of depression or whatever, but now I know what's happening to me, and now I'm not going to panic. But now I can be strategic as well. Yeah. And sometimes just like, oh, I'm an explorer pastor in a traditionalist congregation, and now I can take a 30,000 foot view and go about my day that way and not drive myself into deep conflict and depression with my congregation. It still may not work out in the end, but at least you can be like, oh, this is what's going on. And the more I keep trying to push my explorer self on these traditionalists, the angrier they're going to get, and the crazier I'm going to go. And two, that works vice versa. I've part of the other work we do is work with established congregations on this. And if we could have lay folks, people in the chairs, people in the pews, sort of understand that as well, of like, hey, this may not be a total match here in leadership, but if we're all sort of aware of that, we can work on that together in a healthy, constructive way versus butting heads. Yeah. Because like you said, there's with a clergy shortage and leadership shortage in our denomination, the United Methodist Church, there's just we don't have the luxury to just sort of match everybody up, perfectly. When it does happen, that's great. And I can actually when I look at healthy congregations, I'm like, usually it's because, okay, they're matched here. Like,
right.
Yeah. So Robert, how does that work in the Southern Baptist Church? That's your the tribe you're coming from.
Well, yeah. So yeah, Southern Baptist, it doesn't have the confines of structure. So everything is independent. All the churches, and so I think what you guys are referring to as deacons, what we just call pastors. No matter where you are in the structure or how you are, what authority you're given.
Yeah.
And the only collaboration between any of the churches that make it Southern Baptist is that everybody puts a portion of the church's tithe into a big fund that furthers missionaries around the world who do various things.
Yeah.
So that's that, and that's it. That's it. So Southern Baptist is known for the independence. Like, you can't tell me what to do.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. You know, and what I've witnessed in not just Southern Baptist, but a lot of churches with less denominational structure, let's say, that are congregational, I guess, like just to kind, because there's several denominations that do that kind of model. Is that, you know, what Rob and I are talking about as far as like a pastor being well matched with the congregation. Like that happens kind of organically in those churches, because what happens is if a congregation gets angry with a pastor, or a pastor gets angry with the congregation, they just go start a new church. And I'm not saying that in a derogatory way.
No,
like it's just like that's what happens, and that's how church growth happens in a lot of those kind of. It's not the only way, but it's a way that church growth happens in those kinds of contexts. Is, you know, when and if that kind of confrontation happens or whatever, the pastor just says, okay, I'm going to go start a new church. Or the people in the congregation who are upset say, well, we're just going to go start a new church, and we're going to find a pastor that agrees with us. Right. And it just happens in a different way. You know, you're not locked into that, that structure of itinerancy like we are, where. Yeah.
And explorers who have never had anything to do with the church and who listen to this are like, you guys are insane.
United Methodists make no sense.
All of you are just insane. Like, this is why would you ever tie yourself to any kind of institution? Alas, we were born into it.
Yeah, that's true.
We're living out our therapy right here on
absolutely.
And for me, it's always been Wesleyan theology that has kept me centered in the Methodist world, although there are other places where there are good expressions of that too. But in fact, I've got some really close friends that are Baptist clergy who've been through the Walk to Emmaus experience, which is, it's not really Methodist, but it's very Wesleyan in its theological structure, and they have thoroughly adopted, you know, that Wesleyan theology of grace in their context. So you know,
Now, if people have been listening to this, and even though both of our communities are now unexpectedly national movements.
That's right.
Of dozens of people combined. But we will be back in person together one day. And then two, I think, you know, people may be listening and say, hey, you know what? Social Thread sounds like my thing. Or people are listening and say, New Wineskin sounds like my thing. You know, how can people get involved with what you're doing and learn more and get in touch with you?
Yeah, you know, I think it's kind of a both and. I think, you know, I mean, we're all looking forward to being in person again, but I think what we've discovered as we've done things online is like there's a need for that to continue in some way. And one of the things that we've kind of said as a community now is, and this came from the community really, not from me, is like they want this to now be an online, especially when we started to realize that we weren't bound by proximity anymore, right? That when we started having folks from Arizona, right, and Florida and Cincinnati and Pittsburgh, and, you know, that have become kind of part of our extended community, like that our the core of our group wants to maintain that. So what we've kind of said is we will gather in person again, but it won't be going back to what we did before. It will be a whole new expression of who this community is that exists online, that now is going to have a component of which meets, you know, in a local place. And so what I kind of dream about, kind of big picture, and I know this this kind of dovetails with a lot of the work that you did, you know, like in your research project, was to have, maybe New Wineskins then becomes the hub of a network of local kind of micro communities that are connected, right, through our online presence, but who are also developing relationships in person once we can do that again. So yeah, that's kind of the long way of answering your question. Where can you find us? So New Wineskins, we're online at MOV for Mid Ohio Valley Wineskins. When I went to register a domain name, New Wineskins was already taken. So since we were meeting in the Mid Ohio Valley region of West Virginia and Ohio, that's why the name is what it is. So it's movwineskins.com, and on Facebook and Instagram, it's the same. It's at movwineskins. And then Accidental Tomatoes is accidentaltomatoes.com. And same thing on social media. We're at Accidental Tomatoes. I think on Twitter it's at Accidental TOMA1 because Accidental Tomatoes was too long a handle for Twitter. So, and I didn't realize that until I had already established the account, and I'm like, oh crap, I'm not going back and changing it now.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, you can still find us that way. So, and all of these things, like, even though there's kind of different brands, different names, like the New Wineskins community, Accidental Tomatoes is sort of the content hub for the New Wineskins community, and I'm really working hard at streamlining that even a little bit further.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's where we are. How about you guys?
Yeah. So we are at socialthread.org. You can go on there and sort of find all kinds of stuff, including how to get involved. There's a big button. Click. It says get involved.
And no matter where you scroll, the button is still there. That's
it is.
Really
it is. You can tell what we want people to do when they go to the website. Get involved. If you don't want to get involved, but you want to stalk us, you can sign up for the email newsletter there too. You could also find podcast episodes. If you're listening, you've probably already found the podcast episodes. Mm-hmm. If you're just like, hey, I really enjoy what these guys are doing and want to support the work, you go to socialthread.org/support and make a awesome donation and keep this party going. And what else did I miss? If you come to meetups, we have all kinds of swag for you too. So if you like your bottles,
I got my sticker, man. Thanks.
Yeah.
Awesome. But if you come to,
I'm gonna put it in my Trapper Keeper.
If you come to six meetups, you get this really cool. You can have a choice between this or a fanny pack, which I don't have.
Yeah, so water bottle or fanny pack.
Yep,
it's great.
So. Sweet.
I
got to get on the swag bandwagon. That's where I'm behind on the swag.
You do. I'd wear the hell out of an Accidental Tomatoes.
Oh yeah,
t-shirt.
Absolutely.
I'm going to put that in my 2021 strategic plan.
There you go.
Swag for Rob. That's
swag for the Robs.
Nice.
Cool.
All right. Well, hey Joe, thanks for being here with us, and it's been an amazing conversation, Rob, and all
you tomatoes out there.
And all you tomatoes out there.
And all you tomatoes and threaders out there.
Yep.
Yeah. Oh man, there might be a new brand convergence on the horizon.
I like that.
Threaded tomato.
Threaded tomatoes.
Ooh, nice. Oh, I like that.
Oh man,
that's good.
Well, thank you guys, man. It's been so much fun to have this conversation and to kind of continue that dream about what might be. I think one of the things, and Rob, you and I kind of talked about this in some of our previous conversations, but like we've got to start developing some new paradigms and not just simply trying to adapt old content to new media, but developing whole new ways of thinking about what it means to be, communities of people trying to follow the way of Jesus and everything that goes into that.
So. All right. Hey, thanks everybody. And we will see you next time on the Social Thread podcast
and the Accidental Tomatoes podcast.
Yes. Take care, everybody.